why society has more and more toxic people. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Carl Jung's profound words remind us that the darkness we see in the world is often a reflection of the unresolved shadows within the human psyche. If you have felt like society is becoming increasingly hostile, or that you are encountering more toxic personalities in your daily life, you are not imagining it, but the reason might be deeper than you think. Today, on Spiritual Wisdom, we are going to explore the psychological roots of this rising toxicity, and more importantly, how you can protect your peace and use these challenges to fuel your own spiritual growth. Before we dive in, I have a question for you. Have you noticed a shift in how people treat one another lately? Let me know your experiences in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you are ready to reclaim your power, make sure to like this video and subscribe to join our community of seekers. 1. The 3 main drivers of toxicity. Have you ever walked through a crowded street or scrolled through your social media feed and felt an overwhelming sense of exhaustion, not from physical exertion, but from the sheer weight of the abrasive energy surrounding you? It often feels as though the world has become a theater of hostility, where patience is a forgotten relic and kindness is viewed as a weakness, leaving us to wonder why modern society seems to be drowning in an ever-rising tide of toxic behavior. This is not merely a perception, but a reflection of a profound psychological shift, a darkening of the collective unconscious that Carl Jung might have warned us against, where the very soul of humanity is being buried beneath layers of noise and artifice. To understand this disturbing trend, we must look beyond the surface of rude encounters and peer into the deep, often uncomfortable roots of our modern condition, specifically examining 3 major drivers that are dismantling our capacity for genuine connection. The first, and perhaps most pervasive driver, is a deepening state of emotional numbness, and what can only be described as emotional illiteracy. We exist in an era where modern life is relentlessly overstimulated, bombarding our senses with a ceaseless stream of information and noise that leaves us no sanctuary for silence. In this chaos, people have lost the vital ability to simply sit with their own discomfort or process complex emotions, choosing instead the path of least resistance, avoidance, and blame shifting, rather than engaging in the difficult work of self-reflection, which is the cornerstone of any true spiritual awakening. Many retreat into a defensive shell, creating a generation of adults who can fiercely argue opinions but possess no language to articulate their actual feelings. When challenged, they default immediately to an aggressive survival mode, lashing out not because they are evil, but because they are emotionally illiterate, unable to read the map of their own interior landscape. As we navigate this terrain, we slide seamlessly into the second driver, which is the pervasive culture of instant gratification. We are living in a world designed for fast validation and constant entertainment, a reality that has brewed a dangerous concoction of speed and entitlement. This rapid-fire existence erodes the patience required for deep character building, fostering a mindset where people feel they deserve rewards without the accompanying effort or sacrifice. This sense of entitlement is the antithesis of true spirituality, which demands patience and humility. Instead, the modern mind favors manipulation and shortcuts, viewing other human beings not as souls to connect with, but as obstacles or tools to be used for quick satisfaction. These toxic traits are essentially childish demands magnified by adult capabilities, creating a society that values the quick win over the long, arduous journey of integrity. This hunger for the immediate leads us inevitably to the third driver, the performance of personality. Society has shifted its reward system to favor surface-level identity over the dense, rich substance of inner character, encouraging us to curate a brand of confidence rather than doing the work to develop true, unshakable self-worth. Because so many are merely performing a personality, wearing what Jung would call a heavy persona, they live in a constant terrified state of vulnerability, fearing that a single crack in their armor will reveal the emptiness inside. They attack others to protect the facade, unaware that their toxicity is a defense mechanism for a soul that is starving for authenticity. True healing, and indeed a genuine spiritual awakening, can only begin when we drop this performance, stop seeking instant rewards, and learn the language of our own emotions, stepping out of the toxic noise and into the quiet strength of wisdom. Are you ready to break free from the cycle of unconsciousness? If so, comment below. I stand strong to declare that you will no longer let outside forces control your mind. 2. Why the environment fuels it. Have you ever looked around and wondered why it feels like the world is becoming increasingly crowded with difficult, aggressive, or downright toxic people? It is not just your imagination, nor is it merely bad luck. There are profound environmental and psychological forces at play that are actively fueling this shift in human behavior, and understanding them is crucial for your own spirituality and peace of mind. One of the most significant culprits is the digital landscape we inhabit, specifically how algorithms reward conflict. Social media platforms are designed to capture attention, and unfortunately, anger is the most potent currency online, promoting the loudest, most aggressive voices above those of reason or compassion. When bad behavior gets immediate attention and engagement, it reinforces a dangerous subconscious message to the individual. This works. Do more of it. This feedback loop creates a society where the shadow self, the darker, unintegrated part of the psyche that Carl Jung warned us about, is not only unleashed, but celebrated, pulling us further away from true spiritual development. As we navigate this digital noise, we also face a fundamental shift in how human connection functions, specifically regarding the erosion of consequences. In the past, we lived in tighter-knit communities where your reputation mattered. The village held people accountable, and if you acted with toxicity, you faced immediate social repercussions that forced you to reflect and correct your behavior. Today, that safety net of accountability has dissolved, allowing toxic individuals to burn bridges and simply move to a new job, a new social circle, or a new online platform without ever looking inward. Without the social cost of bad behavior, there is no incentive to change, and this lack of accountability stagnates the soul, preventing the necessary friction that leads to genuine growth and maturity. This lack of external boundaries feeds directly into a frightening internal condition where fragility masquerades as strength. We are witnessing a rise in people who are becoming psychologically fragile or thin-skinned, yet they maintain dangerously high egos to protect that vulnerability. This combination is volatile, because when someone feels powerless and small on the inside, they do not seek to build true inner strength. Instead, they try to seize power from others through control, bullying, or manipulation. It is a desperate attempt to compensate for a lack of spiritual grounding, where the ego builds a fortress to hide its own weakness. True spirituality requires the courage to be vulnerable and the strength to face one's own flaws. But the modern environment encourages the exact opposite: a hard shell of arrogance protecting a hollow interior. By recognizing these patterns, you can stop taking their behavior personally and realize that their toxicity is a symptom of their own spiritual disconnection, allowing you to remain centered, compassionate, and detached from the chaos they create. If this message spoke to your spirit, claim your power against the environment. My inner light is stronger than the darkness around me. I walk my path with wisdom. 3. The toxic delusion. You have likely found yourself in a situation where you look at a difficult person in your life and wonder how they can possibly justify their hurtful behavior. And this brings us to perhaps the most critical insight you will ever learn regarding human psychology and spiritual wisdom, which is that most toxic people do not actually realize they are toxic. It is essential for your own peace of mind that you understand they are not walking around thinking of themselves as villains in your story, but rather they are operating under a profound illusion where they genuinely believe they are merely defending themselves against a hostile world. When you witness their aggression or their sudden outbursts, you must realize that in their internal narrative, they view this hostility as standing up for their truth, confusing their emotional dysfunction with strength and mistaking their lack of impulse control for assertiveness. As the great Carl Jung once profoundly stated, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And this is exactly what is happening in our modern society, where self-reflection is becoming increasingly rare. Because these individuals completely lack self-awareness, they are unable to see their own shadow, that hidden part of the psyche where their insecurities and dark impulses reside. And instead of facing it, they project it onto you. This is why, when you attempt to set a healthy boundary to protect your energy, they do not see it as a reasonable request for space, but rather they view it as a deep personal betrayal. And when you offer a simple disagreement, they perceive it as a vicious attack on their very identity. This creates a confusing dynamic where you might try to use logic or reason to explain your feelings, yet they remain impervious to your words because they are trapped in a cycle of victimhood where they are always the martyr and never the aggressor. In the realm of spiritual wisdom, we understand that this is a state of unconsciousness, a deep sleep where the ego is in the driver's seat, frantically trying to protect a fragile self-image by rewriting reality to suit its needs. You must remember that their behavior is not a reflection of your worth, but a symptom of their own internal war. For as Carl Jung also reminded us, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Yet the toxic person has not yet begun this journey of understanding. They cling to their version of reality because the alternative, admitting they are flawed and have caused harm, is too painful for their ego to bear. Consequently, as society encourages more narcissism and less introspection, we see a rise in these behaviors, where people equate being loud with being right and mistake silence for weakness. To navigate this, you do not need to fix them, for that is an impossible task, but rather you must anchor yourself in the truth that their delusion does not have to become your reality. By recognizing that their attacks are merely their own unhealed traumas projected outward, you can detach with compassion, stepping out of their chaotic storm and remaining centered in your own authentic power. This understanding allows you to stop taking their unconscious actions personally, freeing you from the burden of trying to explain yourself to someone who is committed to misunderstanding you. And ultimately, it empowers you to walk your own path with clarity, leaving the toxic delusion behind as you embrace a life of genuine awareness and peace. 4. The solution: clarity over control. In a world that feels increasingly fractured, you may have noticed a disturbing rise in individuals who seem to thrive on chaos and emotional manipulation, leaving you exhausted and searching for answers. It is a profound burden to carry the weight of trying to heal someone who refuses to be healed. Yet this is the trap so many empathetic souls fall into. We often believe that if we just explain ourselves better, if we offer enough logic, or if we pour out enough love, we can fix the toxic behaviors of those around us. However, true spirituality teaches us that this is an illusion. The harsh but liberating truth you must accept is that you cannot fix these people because their toxicity is not a simple misunderstanding, but rather a desperate defense mechanism designed to protect a fragile identity that cannot survive honesty. They are essentially guarding a house of cards that would collapse the moment they took accountability for their actions. And because their entire psychological survival depends on maintaining this false facade, they will fight tooth and nail to preserve it. Consequently, when you attempt to confront them with the truth or force them to see reason, you are not merely engaging in an argument. You are perceived as a threat to their very existence. This understanding shifts your perspective entirely, leading you to a pivotal realization in your own journey of spirituality. The only winning strategy is to move from a desire to control the outcome to a state of absolute clarity. You must cease the exhausting battle of trying to change their nature and instead choose to understand the mechanics of their behavior without becoming entangled in it. Your strategy must be one of non-reaction, for you must realize that toxic individuals feed on your emotional energy. They require your confusion, your anger, and your desperate attempts to defend yourself to validate their own distorted reality. When you react, you inadvertently hand them the power they crave, confirming that they can control your emotional state. Therefore, the antidote to their poison is your own unshakable self-awareness, which acts as an impenetrable shield. Instead of stepping into the ring to fight a battle that was never yours to begin with, you stand back as an observer, grounded in the knowledge of who you are. As you undergo a spiritual awakening, you begin to see that their behavior is a projection of their own internal war, and it has nothing to do with your worth or your reality. When you remain grounded, clear, and emotionally independent, you starve the toxic dynamic of the fuel it needs to burn. They thrive on the murky waters of confusion and gaslighting, but they wither in the stark light of your indifference and clarity. By refusing to engage in their manufactured dramas, you do not just protect your peace, you dismantle their power to manipulate your reality. This is not about passivity. It is about the active preservation of your soul. You are no longer a victim of their unconscious projections, but a sovereign being who understands that the highest form of power is not controlling others, but possessing such deep clarity that their chaos can no longer touch you. In this space of clarity, you find the freedom that you have been seeking, realizing that the man or woman who does not need to control others is the one who has finally mastered themselves. To affirm your release of the illusion of control, declare your peace. Comment below, "I choose clarity," to anchor yourself in wisdom and inspire others to let go of the chaos. Ultimately, the rise in toxicity we see in society is not just an external event. It is a reflection of our collective shadow. As Carl Jung taught us, the world only changes when the individual changes. By refusing to look inward, we project our own darkness outward, creating the very chaos we fear. The antidote to a toxic society isn't fighting the world. It is the courage to face yourself and integrate your own shadow. If this message resonated with you, please help us spread this light. Hit the like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Spiritual Wisdom. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss our upcoming videos on your journey towards self-discovery. Thank you for watching, and remember, he who looks outside dreams. He who looks inside awakes. You will never die. Alan Watts and the Illusion of the End. Trying to define yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth. Alan Watts once said, and in that single insight, he revealed how deeply misunderstood the idea of death truly is. In this video on Spiritual Wisdom, You Will Never Die, Alan Watts and the Illusion of the End, we explore how the fear of endings quietly shapes our thoughts, choices, and happiness, and how seeing beyond this illusion can transform the way you live right now. As you listen, ask yourself, what would change in my daily life if I no longer feared the end, but trusted the continuity of existence? Share your thoughts in the comments and stay with us as we uncover a perspective that can bring clarity, peace, and a deeper sense of personal growth into your everyday life. 1. The myth of permanence. The belief in fixed, permanent entities is one of the most deeply rooted myths of human culture. Yet it quietly collapses the moment we observe life honestly. What we often call stability is merely a pattern that changes slowly enough for the mind to label it as solid. In reality, everything in the universe exists in motion, including the human body and the sense of self that feels so familiar. The body is not a finished object, but a living process, continuously renewing itself as cells die and are replaced without pause. Even at the most fundamental level, atoms are never at rest. They vibrate, collide, and rearrange themselves in endless movement, revealing that what appears solid is actually dynamic energy shaped into temporary form. This same principle applies to the inner world of the mind. Thoughts, emotions, memories, and moods arise and fade like waves on the surface of the sea, or like weather patterns passing through the sky. No thought stays forever. No feeling remains unchanged, and no emotional state can be permanently held. Yet language creates the illusion that there must be a stable I behind these experiences, a fixed observer who owns them and remains untouched by their passing. Alan Watts pointed out that this idea of a permanent self is not a discovered truth, but a linguistic habit, a convenient way of speaking that simplifies communication while quietly distorting reality. When we say, "I think," or "I feel," it sounds as though there is a separate entity doing the thinking or feeling. But direct observation reveals only thinking and feeling happening on their own. Life, then, is not something one possesses like an object that can be gained or lost. Life is what one fundamentally is. Alan Watts used the metaphor of the ocean to illustrate this truth. The ocean does not have wetness as a property. It is wetness itself. In the same way, you do not have life. You are life in expression. This understanding sits at the heart of spirituality because it shifts attention away from ownership and toward participation. Rather than imagining yourself as a separate fragment struggling within the universe, you begin to recognize yourself as an activity of the universe itself, temporarily appearing as a body, a personality, and a story. Once the myth of a permanent self is questioned, the fear surrounding death begins to transform. If there is no fixed, unchanging entity inside you, then nothing truly dies in the absolute sense. What we call death is not an ending of life, but a change in form, a rearrangement within an ongoing process. Life does not stop. It continues in different patterns, just as a wave does not vanish when it collapses back into the ocean. It simply changes its shape. From this perspective, life is not a noun that can be defined and concluded, but a verb, an ever-unfolding movement, a continual becoming rather than a static being. This realization plays a crucial role in spiritual awakening because it loosens the grip of fear and attachment that comes from identifying with a fragile, imagined permanence. When you stop clinging to the idea of a solid I, you stop resisting change, and with that resistance gone, a deeper sense of peace emerges. You begin to experience yourself not as a thing moving through time, but as the movement itself, inseparable from the flow of existence. In this state, spirituality no longer revolves around escaping death or securing immortality for an individual self. Instead, it becomes a clear recognition that life has never been confined to a single form, and therefore has never truly been threatened by its disappearance. 2. The ego's greatest fear. The ego is simply the sense of being a separate self, a psychological boundary that divides me from the rest of life. And its deepest fear is not pain or loss, but extinction itself. The idea that this boundary could dissolve and the familiar identity it protects could disappear. This fear arises because the ego is built on separation, on the belief that it exists independently from the world around it, and anything that threatens this illusion feels like total annihilation. Alan Watts described this ego as an actor so absorbed in a role that it forgets it is acting, mistaking the character for the whole being. And from this limited viewpoint, death appears as the final curtain, an irreversible ending that confirms the ego's worst nightmare. Yet this fear is rooted in confusion, because the ego mistakes the role for the actor and assumes that when the performance ends, nothing remains. What actually comes to an end, however, is not the self in its deepest sense, but a temporary pattern of experience, a particular configuration of memories, habits, and self-images that once served a function. In Watts' words, the role ends, but the actor remains. The body changes, the personality dissolves, and the story you tell about who you are reaches its closing scene, but the underlying awareness that has been present through every moment of change does not vanish. When this insight moves beyond intellectual understanding and is genuinely felt, the fear of death begins to soften. Because death is no longer experienced as erasure, but as transformation. It becomes a changing of costume rather than the destruction of the stage itself. Another movement in the ongoing play of consciousness that has been unfolding long before this particular role appeared. This perspective is central to spirituality because it invites you to loosen your grip on a fixed identity and recognize that change has always been part of your existence. Everything you associate with yourself has already changed countless times. Your body has replaced its cells. Your thoughts have shifted. Your beliefs have evolved, and your roles in life have come and gone. Yet something has remained constant enough to witness all of it. Spiritual development deepens when you see that this witnessing presence is not threatened by change, but expressed through it. The ego resists this realization because it wants certainty and permanence. But life itself is movement, and clinging to static definitions only amplifies fear. When you begin to identify less with the rigid boundaries of the ego and more with the flowing process of experience, endings lose their terror and become meaningful transitions within a larger continuity. From this understanding, death no longer stands in opposition to life, but reveals its rhythm, showing that creation and dissolution are inseparable aspects of the same process. The practical message is not to deny fear or pretend that endings do not hurt, but to see clearly what is actually ending and what is not. You are invited to live with less defensive attachment to roles and more openness to transformation. To recognize that identity is something you participate in rather than something you own. The deeper lesson is that fear diminishes as awareness expands, and meaning grows when you stop demanding permanence from forms that were never meant to last. In this way, the ego's greatest fear becomes the doorway to insight, guiding you toward a lived understanding that what you truly are has always been larger than any single role, any single story, or any single ending. Have you ever noticed how your ego reacts to the idea of ending or losing control? If this message resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments so we can learn from each other. And if you're ready to look beyond fear and see the illusion for what it is, simply comment, "I am not the ego." And let's walk this path of spiritual wisdom together. 3. Death, the ultimate taboo. Western culture has largely turned death into a forbidden subject, something to be avoided through polite language, euphemisms, and distance, as if refusing to name it could somehow lessen its reality. Yet this avoidance often deepens fear, rather than easing it, because what is hidden from conscious awareness tends to grow more powerful in the unconscious. In contrast, many cultures throughout history have understood that facing death directly can strip it of its terror and restore it to its proper place within life. Medieval Europe's tradition of memento mori did not exist to depress people, but to awaken them, using symbols of mortality as reminders that life is fleeting and therefore sacred, encouraging presence rather than despair. Mexico's Day of the Dead reflects a similar wisdom in a different form, where death is not treated as a cold ending, but as a continuing relationship, honored through color, ritual, and remembrance, allowing grief and joy to coexist without denial. Other traditions go even further by placing direct contemplation of death at the center of spiritual practice. Tibetan charnel ground meditations invite practitioners to observe impermanence without turning away, using the reality of decay to dissolve attachment to the ego and the illusion of permanence. Rather than producing nihilism, this confrontation often produces clarity and compassion because when death is seen clearly, it loses its power to dominate the mind. Alan Watts often emphasized that fear of death comes not from death itself, but from confusion about identity, reminding us that trying to define yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth, pointing to the impossibility of locating a separate, permanent self that could truly be destroyed. When death is approached in this way, it stops appearing as a final annihilation and instead becomes a perspective that sharpens awareness of life, revealing what truly matters and what can be released. Eastern philosophies such as Zen Buddhism and the Upanishads deepen this understanding by teaching that what dies first is the illusion of separateness, not the essence of being. These traditions suggest that beneath the surface identity you call me, there is a deeper continuity that does not begin at birth or end at death. A truth Alan Watts expressed when he said, "You are not a stranger here, but an expression of the same universe that forms stars, trees, and oceans." From this view, grief is not dismissed or minimized because loss is real at the human level. Yet grief is also understood to be shaped by misunderstanding, by the belief that death has erased something essential rather than transformed its form. When this belief softens, sorrow can coexist with reverence, love can remain without clinging, and death itself can be seen not as the enemy of life, but as one of its most profound teachers, offering spiritual wisdom that invites you to live more fully, love more honestly, and recognize that what you truly are was never separate enough to disappear. 4. Beyond the subject-object divide. The fear of death takes root in a subtle but powerful illusion. The belief that there is a clear, absolute boundary between me and everything else, as though the self were a sealed object moving through an external world. Alan Watts repeatedly emphasized that this assumption feels natural only because it is familiar, not because it is true. And when examined carefully, it begins to dissolve. Your body, for instance, is not a fixed entity, but a continuous exchange with its environment, breathing in air that moments ago was part of the sky, absorbing nutrients that once belonged to soil and sunlight, releasing heat, water, and matter back into the world. At no point can you draw a precise line and say, "Here I end and the universe begins," because the body is more like a crossroads of processes than a self-contained thing. This alone weakens the idea that death could be a final separation, since separation was never fully present to begin with. The same insight applies even more deeply to the mind, which people often assume to be the most personal and private aspect of identity. Thoughts, beliefs, values, and emotional patterns are shaped by language learned from others, memories formed through relationships, and cultural symbols inherited long before birth. What feels like an individual inner voice is actually a chorus of influences echoing through a single point of awareness. From this angle, the familiar subject-object divide The sense of a watcher inside observing a world outside reveals itself as a useful mental tool rather than an ultimate truth. It helps us navigate daily life, but it does not describe reality at its deepest level. Alan Watts called attention to this distinction to show that mistaking a practical concept for an absolute fact is precisely what generates existential fear. Because when you believe you are fundamentally separate, the idea of annihilation seems unavoidable. Once this illusion is questioned, an important implication naturally follows. If there is no real boundary separating you from the universe now, then there can be no true separation at death. Death cannot be a falling out of existence, because existence was never confined to a personal container. To clarify this, Watts often used simple metaphors that bypass abstract philosophy and speak directly to experience. One of the most striking is the image of a whirlpool in a flowing stream. A whirlpool appears to be a distinct object with a recognizable shape and location, yet it is nothing more than a temporary pattern formed by moving water. When the whirlpool fades, the water does not vanish. It continues downstream, rearranging itself into new forms. In the same way, what you call the self is a pattern of energy, memory, sensation, and awareness, temporarily organized, not a solid thing that can be destroyed. This metaphor points toward a deeper insight central to both spirituality and spiritual awakening. The self is a process, not an object. Processes do not die in the way fixed things do. They transform. Your heartbeat, breath, thoughts, and emotions are all movements, not possessions. And life itself is an activity the universe is performing through you. Alan Watts captured this elegantly when he said that you are not something separate from the world, but something the world is doing in a particular place and time, just as a wave is something the ocean is doing. When this is understood, death loses its image as a catastrophic ending and begins to resemble a change of rhythm, a shift in expression, rather than a negation of being. From this perspective, spirituality is no longer about clinging to the hope that a personal ego will survive unchanged, but about awakening to the truth that the ego was never the center of existence. Spiritual awakening occurs when the sense of isolation softens and is replaced by a felt understanding of continuity, where life and death are seen as phases within a larger movement rather than opposing absolutes. Fear diminishes not because uncertainty disappears, but because the question itself changes. Instead of asking, "What will happen to me when I die?" the deeper inquiry becomes, "What is this me that is always changing, always flowing, even now?" In seeing that the self is inseparable from the total process of nature, the illusion of a final end quietly dissolves, leaving behind a more expansive, grounded understanding of life as an ongoing transformation rather than a fragile possession that can be lost. Don't forget to subscribe for more spiritual wisdom inspired by Alan Watts, where we explore what lies beyond the subject-object divide and rediscover the deeper truth of who you really are. 5. The cosmic game of hide and seek. The universe can be understood as playing an immense cosmic game of hide and seek with itself, where consciousness deliberately disguises its true unity by appearing as countless separate forms. And when you contemplate this idea deeply, life begins to feel less like an accident and more like an intentional act of exploration. In this view, consciousness does not fracture by mistake, but chooses to experience limitation, individuality, and contrast so that existence can be known from the inside. And this is why many spiritual traditions suggest that separation is not the ultimate truth, but a temporary illusion that allows experience to unfold. Hindu philosophy expresses this insight through the ideas of Brahman and Leela, where Brahman represents the ultimate, indivisible reality, and Leela refers to the divine play in which this reality pretends to forget itself, taking on innumerable forms and stories. And when you see yourself through this lens, your life is not something happening to you, but something happening through you, as the universe explores itself from your unique point of view. Within this understanding, death no longer appears as a terrifying full stop, but as a natural shift in the rhythm of existence, similar to an actor stepping out of one role before entering another, or a player leaving the field only to rejoin the game in a different position. And this perspective does not demand belief, but invites reflection, asking you to examine whether the fear surrounding death comes from reality itself or from the way the mind clings to a single identity. If consciousness can take on many forms, then ending one form does not imply the destruction of consciousness itself, but rather the completion of a particular expression. And this idea gently challenges the assumption that life is a straight line, beginning at birth and ending in nothingness. Seen this way, life is not a linear journey, but an ongoing play, where the true self is not confined to a single body or story, but is the entire universe expressing itself in endlessly creative ways. And when you identify only with your name, your role, or your memories, fear naturally arises because all forms are temporary. Yet when your sense of self expands beyond these limits, a deeper calm begins to emerge. This shift is central to spirituality because it moves awareness away from surface appearances and toward the underlying process that gives rise to them, reminding you that change is not a threat, but the very mechanism through which life remains alive. Death, then, becomes less like an erasure and more like an intermission, a pause that allows the play to continue, a costume change that keeps the performance dynamic. And when approached with this understanding, curiosity begins to replace dread. As your spiritual development deepens, you may notice that much of human suffering comes from resisting this flow, from trying to hold on to forms that are meant to change, whether they are identities, relationships, or even the body itself. And by recognizing that you are not a fragile fragment lost in a vast universe, but an expression of the universe itself, the need to cling starts to soften. This does not make life meaningless or detached, but more intimate and precious, because every experience becomes a temporary yet irreplaceable expression of the whole. In this light, spirituality is not about escaping life or denying death, but about learning to participate fully in the play, knowing that no single role defines the entirety of what you are, and spiritual development becomes the gradual remembrance that beneath all appearances, the same consciousness is always present, changing its masks, but never disappearing. 6. The eternal now. Time is usually understood as a straight line moving from the past through the present and into the future. Yet when you examine your own experience honestly, this way of seeing time begins to fall apart, because you never actually live in the past or the future at all. The past only appears as memory happening now, and the future only appears as imagination or anticipation happening now, which means every experience you have ever had, are having, or will ever have exists only in the present moment. This simple observation, emphasized again and again in spiritual wisdom, and especially in the teachings of Alan Watts, quietly reveals that time as we usually think of it is more of a mental map than a lived reality. When you understand that experience always happens now, something profound shifts in the way you think about death. Death is commonly imagined as a future event waiting at the end of time. Yet that future never arrives as an experience. You can imagine tomorrow, next year, or the moment of death itself, but all of those images appear right now, in this living moment. As Alan Watts often pointed out, the future is a concept, it doesn't exist. And this means death, as something you will experience, is also a concept. No one ever experiences being dead. What people experience is being alive, right up until experience itself ends. In this sense, death is a story told by the mind about a moment that never actually shows up in direct awareness. Mystics across cultures have expressed this insight by redefining eternity, not as endless time stretching forward forever, but as freedom from time altogether. Eternity is not more moments added together. It is the depth of the present moment fully lived. When you are completely present, time loosens its grip, and you notice that life is always fresh, always happening, always new. This is why spiritual traditions emphasize awakening to the present rather than escaping into some imagined future salvation, because the present moment is the only place where life, awareness, and meaning can actually be found. At the heart of this realization is the understanding that what you essentially are is not confined to time. Your body clearly moves through time, changes, ages, and eventually ends. But the awareness that notices these changes does not age in the same way. You can remember being a child, a teenager, and an adult. Yet the sense of I am, watching those memories, feels strangely unchanged. Alan Watts often used this observation to point beyond identification with the body, reminding us that you are something the whole universe is doing in the same way that a wave is something the whole ocean is doing. In other words, your deepest identity is not a temporary object traveling toward disappearance, but a timeless process expressing itself through form. From this perspective, the fear of death begins to lose its power, because it becomes clear that what you truly are was never trapped inside time to begin with. Death belongs to the story of time, while your lived reality belongs to the now. You do not move toward the present from the past, nor do you move away from it into the future. You simply are present, always. Each moment feels new, yet awareness itself remains, watching moments come and go, like scenes in a play. As Watts said, trying to define yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth, because the awareness looking for permanence is already beyond the thing it fears losing. Seen this way, the insight becomes almost disarmingly simple. You do not need to live forever in time, because you already live in the only moment there is. The present moment is not a thin slice between past and future. It is the entire stage on which life appears. When you recognize this directly, death no longer feels like a looming experience waiting ahead, but like a boundary drawn by thought, similar to a horizon that seems solid from a distance yet cannot be reached. This is the quiet message at the core of spiritual wisdom and Alan Watts's teaching. Life is not something you possess for a limited duration. It is something that is happening as you, right now, outside the story of time altogether. If this message about the eternal now resonated with you, take a quiet moment and affirm it within yourself. If you feel ready, repeat after me. I am present in this moment. I release the fear of endings and trust the wisdom of now. 7. Waves on the ocean. You can understand this teaching most clearly through the metaphor Alan Watts loved to use. You are like a wave on the vast ocean of consciousness. A wave has a recognizable shape, a beginning, a peak, and an end. Yet at no point is it ever separate from the ocean itself. It arises from the ocean's movement, exists for a time as a visible pattern, and then subsides back into the same water from which it emerged. When the wave disappears, nothing essential is lost. The ocean has not been damaged or diminished. It has simply changed its expression. In the same way, what you call you is a temporary pattern through which consciousness is expressing itself, not an isolated entity standing apart from existence. The fear of death arises when you mistake the wave for the whole reality. When you identify entirely with your name, your body, your memories, and your personal story, the end of that pattern feels like total annihilation. Yet this is precisely the illusion Alan Watts was pointing toward. The wave believes it must fight against disappearance because it does not realize it is water. Once that realization occurs, the drama of ending dissolves because the wave understands it was never truly separate to begin with. Consciousness does not belong to you. Rather, you belong to consciousness, and what appears as your individual life is simply one of its countless movements. This does not mean that the same personal self continues after death in the way the ego imagines, carrying its biography forward indefinitely. Watts was careful to clarify that this is not a reincarnation of the same psychological identity. The character you play, with its preferences and memories, is part of the wave's shape, and that shape will indeed change. What continues is not the story, but the storyteller, not the role, but the stage itself. Consciousness goes on expressing itself in new forms, just as the ocean continues to produce waves without ever repeating the same one in exactly the same way. This understanding shifts the question from, will I survive, to what am I really? And that shift lies at the heart of spirituality and spiritual awakening. When you look closely at your own experience, you can already see this process happening. Thoughts appear and disappear. Emotions rise and fall. Sensations come and go. Yet there is something constant that notices all of this change. That silent awareness does not age, does not panic, and does not struggle to hold on. It simply observes. Alan Watts suggested that this observing presence is far closer to your true nature than the fleeting patterns you usually identify with. Just as the ocean is not disturbed by the rise and fall of waves, this deeper awareness remains untouched by the constant movement of mental and physical experiences. From this perspective, death is not a violent interruption of life, but a natural transition in the flow of existence. The wave does not fail when it dissolves. It fulfills its nature by returning to the ocean. In the same way, life is not a task you must complete successfully in order to earn continuation. It is a process that is happening effortlessly, moment by moment, through you. The belief that life is something you are doing creates anxiety and resistance, while the recognition that life is something you are allows a deep sense of trust to emerge. This is why spiritual awakening often brings a surprising peace around the idea of death, not because death becomes desirable, but because it loses its power as a threat. Understanding yourself as a temporary expression of a timeless process does not make life meaningless. It makes it vivid and intimate. Every moment becomes precious precisely because it is transient, just as every wave is beautiful because it appears only once in that exact form. When you no longer cling to permanence, you are free to participate fully in the dance of form and change. Alan Watts emphasized that the universe is not a machine grinding toward an endpoint, but a living process continually exploring itself, and your life is one of its ways of doing so. When one expression fades, another arises, and nothing essential is ever truly lost, because the ocean of consciousness remains, endlessly creative, endlessly present, and forever at play. 8. The dream of separateness. Normal waking consciousness can be understood as a powerful dream of separateness, a deeply ingrained belief that you are an isolated self moving through a world made up of other isolated selves, each cut off from the whole. This belief feels natural and unquestionable, just as a night dream feels completely real while you are inside it. You do not doubt the dream world while dreaming. Only when you wake up do you realize that the characters, conflicts, and boundaries you took so seriously were expressions of a single mind. In the same way, many spiritual teachings suggest that what you call ordinary waking life may also be a kind of dream, convincing and meaningful as an experience, yet rooted in a misunderstanding of who you truly are. From this perspective, death is not presented as a final erasure, but as a possible awakening from the dream of separation. Just as waking from sleep does not destroy the dreamer, but simply ends the illusion, death can be seen as a shift in awareness rather than a collapse into nothingness. Physical reality, with all its sensations, relationships, joys, and pains, is real as lived experience. Yet it may not be real as an independent, self-contained structure existing apart from everything else. Experiences happen, but the assumption that they belong to a completely separate entity is what creates fear. When this assumption loosens, spirituality begins to feel less like a belief system and more like a direct insight into the nature of existence. This insight is clearly expressed in the ancient Sanskrit phrase Tatvam Asi, meaning "thou art that," which points directly to the unity between the individual self and the divine whole. It does not say that you will become that unity someday, but that you already are it, here and now, beneath the surface identity you usually inhabit. In this view, the sense of being a separate me is a role temporarily assumed, much like a character in a dream or a wave rising on the surface of the ocean. The wave has a shape, a movement, and a brief history, but it is never truly separate from the ocean that gives rise to it. Awakening to this unity does not require waiting for physical death. Throughout history, this recognition has appeared under many names, including enlightenment, liberation, and satori, all pointing to the same realization that the deepest self is not confined to the body or personal story. Spiritual development, in this sense, is not about accumulating beliefs or improving an isolated ego, but about seeing through the illusion of separateness while still living an ordinary human life. When this awakening begins to unfold, even gradually, your relationship with fear, loss, and identity changes, because the sense of self is no longer tied exclusively to what can be taken away. Seen from this angle, death becomes a transformation of appearance rather than an absolute end. What changes is the form, not the underlying reality. The body, like a costume, is set aside, but the presence that animated it does not vanish. Alan Watts often emphasized that the true self is the dreamer, not the character within the dream. And when a dream scene ends, the dreamer remains untouched. The ending of one appearance simply opens into another way of experiencing existence beyond the limits of time-bound identity. Even within daily life, you can notice hints of this truth by observing that there is something in you that witnesses thoughts, emotions, and sensations without being damaged by them. This witnessing presence was there before every memory and remains through every change, quietly unchanged while everything else shifts. Recognizing this does not pull you away from life. Instead, it allows you to engage more fully, because the fear of total annihilation no longer dominates your choices. Love becomes less about possession, loss becomes less absolute, and meaning becomes something lived rather than desperately sought. The value of this understanding lies in how it reshapes the way you see yourself and the world. It invites you to question the rigid idea that you are only a separate individual struggling against an indifferent universe. It encourages a form of spirituality grounded in direct awareness rather than belief, supporting genuine spiritual development through insight rather than fear. It also gently reframes death as a profound transition instead of a meaningless ending, allowing life itself to be lived with greater clarity, depth, and peace, free from the constant shadow of an imagined finality. Drop a comment below and share how this message resonates with you. If you're ready to release the illusion of separateness and remember your true wholeness, simply type, "I am not separate," to affirm this understanding. 9. Reincarnation versus transformation. Traditional ideas of reincarnation often suggest that a soul survives death by moving from one lifetime to another, as if a personal self were traveling intact through time. Yet this view quietly preserves the belief in a separate and enduring identity, and in doing so, it keeps the illusion of separateness alive. Alan Watts repeatedly pointed out that this assumption is where confusion begins, reminding us that the ego is nothing other than the focus of conscious attention, not a solid thing that can truly be carried forward. When you look closely, what you call yourself is not a fixed entity, but a pattern of experiences, memories, and sensations that is constantly changing, and holding on to it as something permanent is like trying to freeze a flowing river. A deeper understanding invites you to move beyond the idea of survival as personal continuity and toward the insight of transformation, where energy and consciousness are never lost, but endlessly reshaped, expressing themselves in new ways without preserving a single, permanent individual. When you reflect on your body, this truth becomes almost undeniable, because every atom that forms your flesh has a cosmic history, born in ancient stars and shaped by forces far older than your personal story. And after death, those same atoms will not vanish, but return to the ongoing cycle of the universe. In this sense, you have always been part of something vast, and what you call life is simply a temporary arrangement of the cosmos experiencing itself through you. Alan Watts captured this beautifully when he said, "You didn't come into this world, you came out of it, like a wave from the ocean," a metaphor that dissolves the fear of disappearance by showing that waves do not die when they fall back into the sea, but remain water all along. Consciousness follows the same principle, not continuing as the same name, face, or biography, but persisting as awareness itself, exploring new forms just as music continues even when one melody ends. Seen this way, immortality is no longer about preserving the ego or ensuring that a personal identity survives forever, but about participating in the limitless movement of existence itself. This perspective offers a far more profound form of spiritual wisdom because it frees you from clinging to a fixed self and invites you to recognize that change is not a threat, but the very nature of being. Alan Watts often emphasized that trying to define yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth, pointing to the futility of grasping something that is inherently fluid. When you stop insisting on continuity of identity, the fear of death begins to soften, replaced by a sense of belonging to an ongoing dance where beginnings and endings are simply transitions. In this realization, death is not an absolute end, but a transformation, and life becomes an intimate expression of the universe rather than a fragile possession you must desperately protect, revealing why Alan Watts taught that true freedom comes not from surviving as a separate self, but from seeing that you were never separate at all. 10. The cosmic laughter. When one truly sees the nature of death and the nature of the self without filters or inherited fear, a spontaneous and liberating laughter arises, not the laughter of denial or cynicism, but a deep cosmic laughter that comes from clarity, from realizing that the fear surrounding death has always been the fear of losing something that was never owned in the first place. What collapses in this moment is the assumption that life is a possession, that existence belongs to a fixed me moving along a straight line toward an ending. Because once this assumption dissolves, it becomes obvious that running from death is like running from a shadow, exhausting and meaningless, since death has no power to separate you from life itself. This insight lies at the heart of true spirituality and often marks the threshold of spiritual awakening, where fear gives way to understanding and resistance softens into trust. This laughter is not born of despair, bitterness, or emotional numbness. It is joyful recognition, the sudden recognition that reality has always been far more playful, intelligent, and fluid than the mind allowed. Zen masters have long embodied this realization, responding to questions about death not with solemn explanations, but with laughter, silence, or seemingly nonsensical gestures, not to evade the question, but to expose its hidden flaw. The flaw is the belief that reality can be fixed, improved, or made safe through concepts, as if existence itself were broken and needed correction. Their laughter points directly to the absurdity of trying to grasp life with rigid ideas, reminding us that truth is not something to be captured, but something to be experienced. Seen from this perspective, the universe reveals itself not as a mechanical system grinding toward entropy, but as a living, creative event, what ancient traditions describe as Leela, the divine play. Everything that appears is part of a spontaneous dance, endlessly forming and dissolving, with no final destination other than the joy of expression itself. Within this cosmic play, death is not a tragic error or a punishment for living, but a plot twist, a transformation that invites participation rather than resistance. Just as a story loses its power if nothing ever changes, Life loses its vitality if forms never dissolve. And recognizing this reframes death from an enemy into a meaningful movement within the whole. This understanding becomes clearer through the Buddha's flame metaphor, which reveals a profound truth about continuity and change. When a flame goes out, we instinctively ask where it went, assuming it must have traveled somewhere or vanished into nothingness. But the Buddha points out that the flame was never a thing to begin with. It was a process, a dynamic interaction of conditions. And when those conditions change, the flame ceases to appear in that form while the underlying process continues. In the same way, what we call the self is not a solid object trapped inside the body, but a flowing pattern of awareness, sensation, memory, and relationship, constantly changing, yet never separate from the total movement of life. From this view, the true self cannot be destroyed because it does not exist as a fixed entity bound by time or form. What ends is a particular configuration, a role within the play, not the deeper reality that animates it. Alan Watts often emphasized that mistaking the ego for the self is the root of our fear, because the ego is temporary by design, while the awareness witnessing its rise and fall is not confined to beginnings or endings. When this distinction becomes clear, death loses its threatening character and reveals itself as a transition within an ongoing process rather than a final annihilation. As these insights connect, a new relationship with life emerges, one grounded not in clinging but in participation. Spiritual awakening does not demand belief in immortality as a future reward, nor does it require rejecting the physical reality of death. Instead, it invites a direct realization that life is something you are doing, not something happening to you. In this realization, fear relaxes its grip, laughter replaces tension, and existence is experienced not as a fragile journey toward loss, but as a continuous unfolding in which every ending is simply another movement in the infinite dance of being. To conclude, this teaching reminds us that what we fear as the end is only an illusion created by the mind. As Alan Watts beautifully explained, life is not something that happens to you, but something you are participating in an ever-changing flow, where nothing is truly lost, only transformed. When you stop identifying solely with the temporary form and begin to recognize the deeper awareness behind it, the fear of death dissolves, and life becomes lighter, freer, and more meaningful. If this message resonated with you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs a new perspective on life, and subscribe to Spiritual Wisdom for more insights on consciousness, spirituality, and inner awakening. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss our upcoming videos.